Last video for Chapter 3, we're going to talk about fallacies. A fallacy, also known as a fallacious argument, is an argument in which the premises provide only very weak support or no real support at all for the conclusion. Fallacies typically appear to support their conclusions, but in actuality do not, or at least don't do so very well. Thus, fallacies are mistakes in reasoning. As the term is understood in studies of logic, committing a fallacy is distinct from making a factual error. Thus, we can be mistaken about something without committing a fallacy. If that doesn't seem like a clear distinction to you right offhand, let's look at an example. For example, to believe that Thomas Jefferson did not own slaves is erroneous because he did own slaves, but not fallacious. So the two are coming apart here. If someone believes that Jefferson didn't own slaves, they've made a mistake, they believe something false, it's erroneous, but it's not fallacious. And the reason it's not fallacious is the person who does not believe that Jefferson owned slaves is ignorant of the facts, but that person's ability to draw conclusions on the basis of evidence may not be at fault. So what we've got is, if you believe something false, you're misinformed, but you're not necessarily making any logical errors or drawing inappropriate conclusions. You've just got bad inputs, bad information. To commit a fallacy, we must offer or accept non-evidence as evidence for a claim. Let's think back to Chapter 2, where we had this example of the fallacy of equivocation. Premise 1. Madmen should not be allowed to make important decisions concerning the lives of others. Premise 2. My father is mad. Conclusion. My father should not be permitted to make important decisions concerning the lives of others. Now, if premise 2, my father is mad, is referring to your father being angry, we've got a fallacy here because your dad being angry shouldn't be seen as evidence that he shouldn't be allowed to make decisions concerning the lives of others. It's not evidence because the type of mad being discussed above is insanity. So you've accepted, in this case, what shouldn't be evidence, the fact that your father is angry, as evidence for the conclusion that your father should not be permitted to make important decisions concerning the lives of others. That's why that's fallacious. You've taken a piece of non-evidence, your father's anger, and turned it into, or tried to turn it into, a premise to support a conclusion. Fallacies can mislead us for many reasons. Some fallacies arise as a result of violating logical standards for valid deductive arguments and strong inductive arguments. Sometimes, our emotions interfere with our ability to make unbiased judgment, opening the door for certain types of fallacies that capitalize on those emotions. Take, for example, the appeal to pity. So, the appeal to pity is a type of fallacy, also called ad misericordiam in Latin, and it occurs when we confuse feeling sorry for someone with evidence for the truth of an assertion that is made about that person that we feel sorry for. So, take the example of a lawyer that defends her client against criminal charges by pointing out how tough the defendant's life has been. That's non-evidence. That claim might be relevant evidence to alleviating the punishment inflicted on the defendant if the defendant is convicted. But it shouldn't be evidence that we consider as to whether or not the defendant did or did not do the deed in question. So if you think, this person's less likely to have committed the crime because their life has been hard, if there's not the proper correlation between one's life being hard and the likelihood that someone will commit that kind of crime, you're giving into fallacious reasoning. So that's the appeal to pity. Aside from exerting emotional pressure, like what happened in that appeal to pity, a fallacy can deceive us by its resemblance to a correct form of argument. One of the reasons for studying the formal structure of arguments, as we do in the following chapters, is to be able to recognize such fallacies. So what's going to happen in the weeks ahead, we're going to look at some legitimate forms of arguments, and then we'll see some fallacies that closely resemble those different forms of arguments. But for now, we're going to look at a few different types of fallacies. Okay, this first one, mistaking correlation for causation. Those of you in the life or social sciences may be familiar with these sorts of mistakes already. So let's take a look at this little example. Sleeping with one's shoes on is strongly correlated with waking up with a headache. There's our premise. And then the conclusion, therefore, sleeping with one's shoes on causes headaches. Here, the arguer has assumed that the correlation between wearing shoes to bed and headaches in the morning shows that wearing shoes to bed causes headaches. What the arguer fails to take into account is that there is a much more plausible third factor, which is the causal factor explaining the connection, namely going to bed drunk. This next type of fallacy we'll be looking at is called the fallacy of black and white thinking. A fallacy of black and white thinking occurs when one mistakenly bases an argument on a premise, either stated or unstated, that only two choices are available when a wider range of alternatives in fact exist. Other names for the fallacy of black and white thinking include false choice, false dilemma, and false dichotomy. In particular, this last name for the fallacy of false dichotomy, is one I'll be using later on in this course. Okay, let's take a look at an example of a fallacy using false dichotomy. So, first premise. Either the doctors can explain how Mrs. Nim was cured, or it is a miracle. But the doctors can't explain how she was cured. Second premise. Therefore, Mrs. Nim's cure is a miracle. Now, the reason why this is a fallacy is because this first premise represents the false dichotomy of there being only the options of her cure being explainable by doctors or being a miracle. The problem is there are certain things that doctors can't explain, certain things that doctors don't know about yet, certain advances in science that haven't been made, that can still function as a natural, non-miraculous explanation for why someone was cured. So there's a third option here. There's natural cures that doctors can't explain. But the way this argument's structured, that option's completely left out, and because it's assumed that there's only two options, and that one of the options isn't the case, it's got to be the other. So that's the basic structure of a false dichotomy. The first premise assumes either A or B. The second premise says, well, not A. And then you conclude, well, it's got to be B. When there really are only two options, this is a great form of reasoning. But you have to make sure there's really only two options. In this case, there was more than two, so this argument is fallacious. Another common type of fallacy is called begging the question. In everyday language, to beg the question often just means to raise the question, or to lead naturally to the question, or even simply to ask the question. But this phrase has a specific, more technical use in logic and critical thinking. In this sense of the phrase, to beg the question is to assume that something is true without providing any justification for the claim. For example, to say that a particular herb cannot be harmful because it is found in nature begs the question of whether all natural things are harmless. So if we had this little argument here, herb X is found in nature, therefore herb X cannot be harmful, well, the first thing we want to ask is, what's the relationship between being found in nature and not being harmful? On the face of it, there doesn't seem to be anything about something being natural that necessitates that it can't be harmful, unless we've got an implicit premise that nothing found in nature is harmful. Now we've got an argument that seems to at least follow. If the premises are true, then this conclusion will be true. If herb X is found in nature and nothing found in nature is harmful, then herb X cannot be harmful. The question is, are these premises grounded? In particular, is this second one, the claim that nothing found in nature is harmful, is that grounded? Socrates, who died from drinking poison hemlock, which is natural, might disagree. So often what happens in reasoning where one begs the question is that one assumes the truth of the very conclusion while arguing for the conclusion. Thus, the premises one offers for the conclusion are only grounded if the conclusion is first assumed to be true. Let's take a look at an example of that. Premise 1. I've experienced what can only be described as paranormal activity. Conclusion, therefore, paranormal activity is real. The problem here is if you have a certain experience and the only option you're allowing for is that it's paranormal activity, well, duh, then paranormal activity has to be real. You've assumed that your experience is in fact one of paranormal activity. But that's the matter being questioned. You can't just say it's paranormal activity, therefore paranormal activity is real. You have to show why this experience couldn't be described as anything but paranormal activity. This is sort of a paradigmatic kind of case of begging the question, where the conclusion ends up being assumed in one of the premises. Because of the circular nature of begging the question, in which the premises ground the conclusion, and the conclusion in turn the premises, begging the question is often also referred to as circular reasoning. Alright, so that's a brief overview of fallacies, and that's all we got for Chapter 3. Next, we're moving on to Chapter 4. See you then.